Well, you look marvelous today, and thank you once again for joining me as we continue our chronological study through the entire New Testament. And we're back in the heart of Galatians, a little more than halfway through here in chapter 3. But before we dive into chapter 3, I just want to tell you, I was thinking prior to making this broadcast of what's the overriding theme found in the book of Galatians. So if I could summarize it in one sentence, what would that one sentence be? And I thought about it and came up with this sentence: you have no obligation to keep the law of Moses. And that's basically it. And if you know that, you know what you really need to know from the book of Galatians. And as I pause and think about that for a moment, and I need to be careful as to how I say this, that helps us to understand, at least in one sense, and bear with me as I say this, how non-relevant Paul's letter to the Galatians is to you and to me. Because chances are there's nobody who's trying to convince you that you need to keep the law of Moses in order to be saved, right? I mean, that does happen occasionally in our modern era, but the average Christian is not being taught that false doctrine. There aren't people standing up in front of your church on Sunday giving sermons on how if you aren't circumcised and aren't keeping the feasts and the various ritualistic and ceremonial aspects of the law of Moses, you can't be saved. That's not happening, right? Right. So that means the general message here, the overriding message of Galatians, really isn't relevant to you or to me at all. But one reason we're taking our time to look at it more closely is because of the fact that the message, the overriding message in the book of Galatians has been distorted by modern day teachers who have changed that simple sentence that I gave you that summarizes the whole thing into a different sentence that today says you don't have to obey any of God's commandments and you can get to heaven. You're under no obligation to do anything related to holiness, and you're still okay with God. That's the distortion. And so I'm trying to show how that is by no means the message that Paul was trying to communicate. When he talks about the fact that we're not under the law, he's talking about the law of Moses, and specifically about those ceremonial and ritualistic, non-moral, non-ethical components of the law of Moses, because when you take away the entire law of Moses, you still have the law of Christ. And Paul definitely believed we're under obligation to obey the law of Christ. Can I reference you to a verse in the final chapter of this same epistle, Galatians chapter 6, and verse number 2. Listen closely. See if you can get the obvious, clear meaning in this verse. Bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. Did you get it? You see, obviously, it's not debatable, indisputable, irrefutable. No argument against this. Paul believed that his readers were under obligation to fulfill and to keep and to obey the law of Christ, and they do that by bearing one another's burdens, that is, loving each other, which is a commandment that Christ gave to us in his law, the new commandment, that you love one another even as I have loved you. All right? So there's still law. There's still holiness. There are still commandments to keep. What's under discussion in Galatians is, the law of Moses and really only the law of Moses. Okay, so keep that in mind. And again, I'm just kind of preaching to myself here. As we dissect this book, I'm just wondering of the real value of dissecting this book that doesn't have a lot of relevancy, at least in the overriding theme, to me and to you. Again, modern-day preachers make it relevant, supposedly, by twisting it and saying, you see, it's all of grace, none of law, holiness is not a component, and anyone who says that it is a legalist, and so just believe in Jesus, and then, you can sin all you want. Now, see, that becomes very relevant. I've got to undo that heresy. All right. All right, so now we go back to Galatians chapter 3, and remember that Paul was making numerous arguments as to why Gentiles don't need to worry about keeping the law of Moses, and one of them is the fact that God promised Abraham in about 1900 BC that in his seed all the families or nations of the earth will be blessed. All the Gentile nations will be blessed in Abraham's seed, that is Christ. And the law of Moses wasn't even given until 430 years later. Okay, and so Paul's saying, obviously, that God is not changing the game midstream. He's not adding conditions, to the promise he gave to Abraham 430 years later. I mean, nobody adds conditions to a covenant or to a contract, even in a human realm, Paul argues. And so why would God ever do such a thing? God who never lies. All right, so we're going to pick up where we left off last time in verse number 19. The logical question that Paul's readers would ask is posed by Paul in Galatians 3:19. Why the law then? And what a great question that is. I mean, well, if it had no bearing on the salvation of the Gentiles and really the salvation of the Jews ultimately as well, why was the law given then? And here's Paul's simple answer. It was added because of transgressions. And so I wish Paul had elaborated on that a little bit more, and better defined what he meant. But that's the reason it was given, because of transgressions. And I don't think he needs to elaborate on it so much that we can't just by ourselves take what he wrote and figure it out. All right, because it can only mean one of a couple of things. Only one of them actually makes sense. Okay, either he means is that it was added because of transgressions that were going to be committed, or transgressions that had already been committed. And whose transgressions is he referring to there? All right, well, those are questions we're going to answer in our next segment. Okay, so I'll see you next time.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.